leadership stuff, and that's the basics. He was, people trusted him. He had a highly developed sense of integrity. He was extremely competent, which is probably the number 2 thing you should know what you're about. It's important to look good. People need to respect you. It's important to be physically fit, and Coach gives us all of those things. And I think if you look at people who wind up in leadership positions, you'll find that most people have most of that stuff. I feel like I'm wasting your time telling you things that's probably already in your books.
Sure.
I'll be happy to spend the next 10 or 15 minutes or whatever you want answering questions, or if anybody wants to hear war stories, that's always good too. I do a lot of this. Anybody?
Go.
Can we hear about the Desert Storm?
Yeah, well, actually, here's the guy who was on the ground in Desert Storm. I'd be happy to do that. I was an office soldier in Desert Storm. I was in Washington, D.C., and I was the operations guy. 3 in your world.
Yes, sir.
Only it's better in the Air Force somehow. And I was the director of operations for the Air National Guard. At the time, we had something like 96 flying units and a couple hundred ground units. I have vivid memories of being there when the first night and watching it on TV. We right away mobilized a couple of Air National Guard big airplane units. And probably one of the bigger successes of all of that we don't hear much about was the logistical. Moved a city the size of Charleston to the desert. There was an Army 3-star fellow named Papadakis who was in charge of all that. Not very glamorous, but astoundingly important. So anyway, we mobilized a couple of big airplane units, pilots, KC-135 air refueling units. And you talked about South Carolina Air Guard. One of my stories is I was in the office of the director of the Air National Guard, who was a 3-star. And we were on the phone to the commander of Tactical Air Command, basically fighter command in those days. And our effort was to get some Air National Guard fighter units into the fight. And General Russ agreed that that was a good thing, and we did a order of merit list of our F-16 units, and we offered up 2. One was the South Carolina unit, because they'd been in the airplane a very long time and had a lot of experience. And one was the Syracuse, New York unit, which was far less experienced, but they had a 30mm gun that they carried on their F-16, which was unusual. A 30mm gun shoots a bullet about that big. It's astounding. It's the same gun that the A-10 carries. The gun is literally the size of a Volkswagen. The A-10 was built around the gun. And we offered up a couple of A-10 units, and General Russ agreed. We wound up sending the South Carolina guys. We sent the A-10 unit from Massachusetts, and we sent some. We still had some RF-4s in the inventory. The active duty Air Force did not, but we sent some elements from an Alabama National Guard unit of reconnaissance F-4s that had a long lens camera that was unusual and in great demand over there. Because that photo reconnaissance is pretty much done away with now in the world of unmanned aerial vehicles. So all of that, seeing that from this end was interesting and fascinating, and we used to do a daily or nightly phone call with everybody to get an update so we could brief it in the Pentagon.
What else?
What else?
Anything about Vietnam?
Yeah, Vietnam, I'm sure seems like 100 years ago to you guys, and I guess it was. Different world. I was there in 1968, and so that was about the time of Woodstock, about the time of Bobby Kennedy's assassination, Martin Luther King, over there like the world is coming apart back home.
Were you in Vietnam or were you in Thailand?
I was flying out of Thailand.
Out of Thailand, okay.
Udon, Thailand. And the way that looks, Vietnam is long and skinny, and Thailand is up on the top end of Vietnam. So we flew from Udon, Thailand, all the reconnaissance missions and a lot of the fighter missions over North Vietnam. And the people stationed in South Vietnam tended to do South Vietnam stuff. It was about 15 minutes from our base to the border. You may have heard of Gia Pass. It was a place where a lot of the logistical stuff flowed from North Vietnam to South Vietnam. And we would, I was in the reconnaissance business at the time, and we would take optical photography and infrared photography every night of certain points, choke points, ferry crossings along the rivers.
Was this the Ho Chi Minh Trail?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay. All right.
And the Ho Chi Minh Trail is kind of a loosely connected network. Sometimes roads, sometimes dirt roads, sometimes cart paths, sometimes footpaths in the jungle. The Vietnamese were astounding. They would put a couple of 100 pounds of stuff on a bicycle and push it from Hanoi to Saigon. Remarkable people, very industrious, ingenious, and patient. Patient. And that's something that as Americans were not. And they didn't, I think they determined early on that they didn't have to beat us, they just had to not lose. And that's a failing that we have, I think, because eventually we'll get bored and go away. That tends to be our history. We seem to be working that differently in Afghanistan. But, our history has been, if it doesn't happen quickly, we're going to leave. And that's too bad. Anyway, we flew all of our missions up north. I was 22 years old. I was a pilot in the F-4. We had a crew of 2, pilot and a navigator. I thought my navigator was elderly. He was in his early 30s. And I think I had 300 hours total time, flying time. I was a first lieutenant. And I didn't realize how dumb I was. Very fortunate to have survived all that. And I had a guy in the back seat who was far more mature and far more cautious, probably saved my bacon several times.
Did you fly high or did you fly low? And just,
Yeah.
Did you receive any ground fire?
Yes, and we did both. In those days, the philosophy was to go real low and real fast to avoid radar. The game changer in Vietnam were the SAMs, and that had not, that kind of guided missile air defense had not been a factor anywhere else. The SAMs would drive you down to the low altitude environment, and the low altitude environment is anything up to about 4,000 feet, which exposes you to anti-aircraft artillery, which is somebody shooting at you with a gun. And frankly, you could bring down a jet airplane with a rock if you manage to get it in the engine. So by forcing you down into that environment, it made you vulnerable. And the tactics changed from going real low, real fast to going at a medium altitude. And some of the stuff we did was high altitude reconnaissance with different sensors that are about 30,000 feet. One of the more interesting things was, I said, optical photography. And in those days, there was nothing digital, and people actually developed the film. So if we were trying to take a picture with optical photography, since it basically used a flash bulb, it required you to get pretty low, so below 700 feet. And we had big magnesium flares that about the size of a big shotgun shell that came out of the back of the airplane. And there was a sensor on the bottom of the airplane that when that thing reached peak illumination, the camera would take a picture. The problem is you don't cover much ground that you can illuminate, so you got to get down pretty low and be very precise. But when that comes out, if you're off a second or two, you miss the target. We got very good at that. And that was 90% of the guy in the back seat had that all figured out. He's a math wizard. It also made you very vulnerable because if you wanted to take a picture of the target and get it in the third frame, you needed 5 of those flares, and you go 1, 2, 3. He's going to be right there. So it was pretty predictable. some of the better backseaters could do it in 3, which was nice. And then there was a choice of, do you do it heading out toward the water in case something bad happens, or do you fool them by coming in from the water? It was interesting times. It was, you know, a watershed event for me as a young man. It's almost nothing. It's, Winston Churchill, I think, said that there was nothing quite so invigorating for a young man as to be shot at without effect. I suspect that's true. It has a way of focusing your attention somehow. But very complex time in our history, and fascinating to be part of it, and fascinating to be part of the experience in Iraq as well. I would offer that up to you. Anybody else?
You graduated from Brown. What made you enlist in the Air Force?
My mother asked that. I don't know. My dad was a World War II Navy pilot who was killed in the Pacific. I never knew him. I was about a year old. So that's an interesting thing as well. If your dad is alive, you have some glimpse of the future. And it's not the kind of thing you think about every day, but it's something that I didn't have. And my mother, who passed away a year or so ago, lived to be 96, but the day she died, she'd say, "You're just like your father." Mannerisms or something like that. So I don't know where that flying interest comes from. Brown at the time had ROTC, and a buddy of mine, and I was not in the Air Force ROTC, a buddy of mine was, and the Air Force was paying for him to get flying lessons. A great deal. And so when I graduated, or as I was getting ready to graduate, I went to see the recruiters. By the way, in those days, the draft was on. And the way that worked is every young man at the time would register at 18, and Selective Service would draft you into the Army. So this was, I graduated in 1964, and Vietnam was just spooling up. So I went down to the Air Force recruiter and said, "Hey, I want to be an Air Force pilot." He laughed right out loud and said, "Okay." And then I explained that because my dad was killed in World War II and I was a sole surviving son of a deceased veteran, I did not have a draft requirement, and I could in fact wait for 3 or 4 or 5 months until a pilot training slot became available. So I said, "Oh, in that case, sign you up." And they would actually guarantee you pilot training, assuming you could pass the physical and everything. So went through officer training school, went to pilot training, which was a year. It was in Selma, Alabama at the time. It was the year of the March. A lot going on in this country. That was a wonderful experience. Went from there to fighter lead-in, spent a couple of months out in Idaho doing that, more training, and then went to Vietnam. By then it was 1968. So I felt kind of a need to do something, and I don't know what now. Several of my classmates were drafted in the Army, and went over there as lieutenant, forward artillery observers, and that was not good for longevity. Anybody remember Governor Ridge? Governor Ridge was drafted and went. Was a Harvard graduate. How would you like to have been his sergeant? Commuter college boy. Governor was, no kidding, combat soldier in Vietnam, earned a Bronze Star. To this day, good guy, great guy to work with or work for. Anything else? Okay, go ahead.
What was your favorite aircraft?
That's a hard question. I really like the F-100. The F-100 is a certifiable antique. Mid-50s vintage airplane. It was the first airplane that could achieve supersonic speed in level flight. It took a lot of fuel to do it. It wasn't really very practical, but it was designed as a high-altitude interceptor. And as time went on, we hung tanks on it, gas tanks and bombs and everything. It was used mainly in Vietnam as a combat air support airplane supporting troops on the ground. The F-4 I flew over in Vietnam. That was my first airplane, which I liked a lot. most guys who claim to be fighter pilots will tell you that they like single-seat, single-engine airplanes. I later flew the A-7, which was a Navy airplane, single-seat, single-engine. And I flew the F-111, kind of reluctantly, but I wound up loving it. It was a great airplane, and technological marvel, but probably ahead of its time. We lost a bunch of those in Vietnam.
So was the A7, in order to spot your target, you had to be upside down and then come back around?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily, okay.
The A7's kind of a short, stubby airplane, flat nose, not lovely by any stretch of the imagination. The Navy used it as an attack airplane. It was an A4, A7. It's kind of a follow-on to the A4. Carry all kinds of bombs and stuff. Really, really accurate. The first airplane we had with a 111 had a similar thing, but totally computerized bombing systems. You could put the white spot on the target. That's where the bomb would hit. Remarkable stuff. Neat airplane. We did a lot of that, mostly to roll in, not necessarily to acquire the target. I want to take a second, if I may, give you something that has become kind of a pet peeve of mine, and when I speak, I usually do this. And I think it's important for folks like you. Today, there are well over 300 million of us living in this country, yet there are only 2.5 million men and women in military service. That means that all of our fighting and the sacrifice is done by considerably less than 1%. Always, in this country, military service was a reflection of our society. And when I was your age, it was literally impossible not to know somebody whose father, brother, somebody was in the service or had served. And the draft had a lot to do with that, I'm sure. It was literally impossible not to know somebody. And I can remember having a construction job as a college student in summer, and one of the guys that worked with me was just out of the Army. That was the normal thing. Today, however, the undemocratic reality is that most Americans have grown detached from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And while we see a lot, people respect